So that's good. Okay, so let's get started. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody, depending where in the world you are joining us from today. A warm welcome from me. My name is Connie Clare, and I'm the Community Development Manager at the Research Data Alliance, and I'm really delighted to be your host for today's webinar, which is organised by the RDA. And today's session is all about RDA web accessibility and how we can make RDA's work, and particularly our recommendations and outputs, more digitally accessible. And we're very fortunate to have a wonderful expert speaker on this topic, Dr. Kim Ferguson from DANS, an RDA in the Netherlands. And before I introduce Kim in more detail, I just wanted to share some housekeeping points with you. When my slides actually change, there you go. So this session is being recorded, and the presentational aspect, not the discussion, will actually be made available on the RDA web platform. So you will be able to revisit it and share it with your colleagues after the event. I also just want to make you aware that we do have a show captions feature in Zoom, which is on the bottom toolbar. So that will allow you to read along with the discussion and the presentation today if you want to give that a try. Just also to let you know that we do have time for a Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions that spring to mind during Kim's presentation, please do feel free to put those in the chat, and we'll try to address as many as possible before we close the session today. And just to remind you, this is an RDA organised event, so we will be adhering to the RDA's Code of Conduct. I've put a link for that in the chat. And if you're new to the RDA, then welcome. You're very welcome to join our community. Individual membership is free and open to anybody interested. So also you can access the link in the chat for that too. And just to give you some very brief background, in case you're not aware, the RDA is a community-driven initiative that was established back in 2013. And since that time, it's grown to comprise more than 16,800 members, spanning 150 different countries. And all of our members share this common vision and mission that researchers and innovators openly share and reuse data across different boundaries, so across technologies, disciplines, and countries to address the grand challenges of society. And our mission is that our stakeholders work together to build the social and technical bridges that enable open sharing and reuse of data. And importantly, at the heart of everything that we do are our 6 guiding principles of openness, consensus, inclusivity, harmonization. We are community driven and non-profit and technology neutral. And that means that all of the work that we achieve within the RDA should be openly available for adoption and reuse by anyone, anywhere in the world. But of course, that doesn't always mean that it's as digitally accessible as it possibly could be. And so this is why we have this timely topic. And it's now my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Kim, for today. And Kim is currently working as a research data management specialist at DANS in the Netherlands, which is the Data Archiving and Network Services, an institute of the Royal Dutch Academy of Sciences. Kim is also the community manager for RDA in the Netherlands, which is an active regional group. She has a background in biology and a PhD in genetics from Wageningen University. And as you'll be able to tell throughout the presentation, she's passionate about open science, but also about disability advocacy in academia. And she has extensive experience of running these kinds of training sessions and webinars on disability and accessibility in STEM. So that's science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So this is an important topic for the Research Data Alliance today. We hope that we can come away with some information, insights, and guidance on how we can make our work, recommendations, outputs, and other digital content more digitally accessible. And so on that note, I'll stop sharing my screen and I will hand over to Kim to start with her presentation.
Perfect. Ooh, that was a new option I've never seen before, but okay. So let's go up here. So first thing I want to do is first thanks for inviting me and having me. And the resource that I'm showing right now is a checklist that we're going to talk about later. So first I was like, all right, let's share the checklist. I've also put it in the chat. And we'll walk through it later. But for now, just a brief introduction into web accessibility, what it can mean, what it can mean to you personally, as an organization. So first, what is web accessibility? And this is especially funny for me, coming in and working in the field of open science and fair data. And there's an accessible in fair, but that's a different accessible. So when we talk about accessibility in this context, we're really talking about the interface between society and people with disabilities who are members of that society. Specifically, web accessibility is ensuring that the technology and information communicated via web technology is accessible by people with disabilities. So, in practice, this often means referring to guidelines or practices that can help web-based content be usable and understandable to a wider audience. So, one of the best examples for that for web-based services, such as websites, is the WCAG 2.0. This is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And these are often referred to in legal statutes. These are guidelines that are put out by the World Wide Web Consortium, an agreement between different web developers of here's how we're going to best structure the web from the back end so that it can be usable by everyone on the front end. So that's one example of web accessibility. But when it comes to things like slide decks, documents, even emails, or social media, then we have to start thinking along with what tools are being made available to us as users and how can they be used to make things as accessible as possible. And that's the context that I'm going to talk about here. So, but first you can consider, and this is a bit of a why bother with accessibility? That's a bit of a rich question. I mean, I think you should always bother with it, but sometimes we have to think about the different ways that our decisions can impact each other as well as the organizations that we work for. So, why care about web accessibility? So first, it could be legal, depending on where you work, depending on the requirements of your organization or funding agreements. It could be part of the legal structure to make publicly available assets as accessible as possible. This could be if you're in Europe, this is the EU Web Accessibility Act. If you are based in the United States of America, this would be the Americans with Disabilities Act or the ADA. So there's plenty of different frameworks where accessibility is in mind, as well as if you have public funding, you might be required to consider this as a contractual agreement. So legally, sure. But most of the time, we are acting within an organization, not as an individual person, and then the legal aspects kind of don't touch us as often. So next you consider morally. Morals are personal. Morals are individual. You have to decide, how does this affect me as a person and my perspective that I have in the world that I move in. But it could just be important to you to try to be as open, as inclusive as possible. And then you can consider accessibility in that. Ethically, when we talk about if you're working in the field of science or citizen engagement or the humanities or just academia in general, you can consider what are your ethics as an informed and privileged scholar. Also, what are your ethics to your colleagues, let alone the general public as well? Because when we talk about accessibility, we're also talking about the people who we work with on a collegiate level. How are we making sure that our colleagues can access information and access our documents? And then finally, practically. And this I say with as much generosity as possible. You don't know what your future is going to be like. You can future-proof your own work. And a lot of the times, the tools that we use to make our work accessible also make it better machine readable because they're using metadata or formatting that is used by machines to make work more machine readable. As well, it can often improve things like the translatability of work so that it's readable or viewable across multiple languages. Or if we're working in areas where the internet is not as reliable, having accessible work can also help with that because we're thinking of different options made available for people to access materials. So that's why you should care about it. And finally, it can contributes to open science, I think generally. If you really just want the easy one, it's like, hey, you're doing your part. So let's check out the list itself, and we're just going to walk through it. Now, we don't have a lot of time, so I was like, okay, we're going to do a basic walkthrough of the list. I'm just going to view Zenodo here and go into a bit. So This checklist I first created with the RDA for the project RDA Tiger back in late 2024, uploaded it to Zenodo. I updated it in 2025, and just for this session, I've updated it to version 2.0. And that was because talking with the folks within the RDA that so much of the work done within the RDA working groups or interest groups is done in a collaborative environment like the Google Suite. So I needed to make my checklist also applicable to working with Google Docs and working with Google Slides. Previously, I had put a lot of my emphasis on using the Microsoft Accessibility Checker. I still swear by it, I still recommend it, but I have to meet people where they are if we want to start making cultural change, right? So if you're working with Google Docs, how can you do that accessibly? Here's a checklist that does pay some credence to that question as well. So the checklists there are two of them. The first two pages, I believe, are for slide decks, and they go through the different considerations that you can look for. And then the second checklist is for documents. And I have been for creating this checklist, I call upon a few different sources. Often, I first point people to sources that are made by people who use the accessibility features because they know what works best for them. And the Microsoft Accessibility Checker has additional documentation on how you can use it throughout the Microsoft Office suite. And for the Google Slides, there isn't necessarily a guide drafted by Google, but there is a great guide written or that's hosted by the Perkins School for the Blind in the United States, and they have a very comprehensive method on how to work with Google Slides. So again, we're just going to walk through this briefly. I'm going to point to a few things to keep in mind when it comes to slide decks. We usually think of these as very visual media, but what happens when a visual media needs to be interpreted in multiple ways? This could be someone who uses a screen reader to access information, or someone who is viewing the slide afterwards and is trying to have additional context that they missed in the initial presentation of it. So a screen reader is a technological tool that it does what it says. It reads the screen. How do you read the screen? You have to use the formatting made available by the technology. And for a slide deck, that's often things like text boxes, different types of alternative information that's put on a visual representation, as well as the order. So that's what you have to keep in mind for a slide deck is the information using the proper technological tools? So the first is talking about slide structure, things to keep in mind. You know, really, there's sometimes a practice within academia to have as few slides as possible because that feels good, but then to overload those slides with information and different text boxes and different fields. And that's where like you really should consider what the information is being presented and how it's going to be interpreted. So that's the first recommendation and specific for Google Slides, and this is going to be tricky for organizations that use Google Slide decks, is using a set template rather than building from scratch, because when you add a text box to Google, it doesn't necessarily give it the additional information that it is a text box. So sometimes it's not even picked up by a screen reader. You have to go in and give it that additional context, but there's always ways around this. So text formatting, most recommendations for text size are this information varies when you see it, and you might wonder why. And you can think of it as pre-hybrid work environments or post-hybrid work environments. So back when these recommendations were for slides, they were for projected onto a screen, projected into a big lecture hall. What is the biggest size that you need for something that is being projected into a shared space? Where now we also have to consider what is the biggest size for potentially someone viewing on a mobile phone or potentially someone viewing on a tablet. So often you want to even increase the font size even further because you don't know the size of the screen that the information is being viewed on. But this is why the minimum sizes are what we talk about and not a size range. Minimum, we're thinking, okay, projected into a room. If you know it's going to be an online only presentation, you might even want the size font to be bigger. Then we go into color and contrast, and there's two tools I want to point out here. The first is a contrast checker. High contrast is, well, basically the difference between the background and the text. You want to have high contrast so that the text is legible, but you also don't want it to be overwhelming visually. And so you can best check that with a contrast checker. A lot of the times house styles have this by default, but even sometimes the next level down will be like, oh, gray. Well, gray and white lead to not so great contrast checking. So you can kind of figure this out just to give a quick pass to see. And the other thing I want to point out is checking images for color suitability when it comes to color blindness or contrast as well. And there is a tool online, it's called VizCheck, and you can upload an image and it will check it using mathematical algorithms just to see if the colors next to each other are different enough to be able to show difference depending on the type of color vision deficiency being checked for. I will say this falls under what we would in the Creative Commons think of as a derivative if you want to change the image. So if you do this with an image, you have to make sure you're working with an image where it is either your own, you've created it, and you just want to improve it, or you're working with an image that falls under derivatives are possible because it is altering it slightly. So we've made an image. Now what do we do with it? In a slide deck, alternative text is one of the most important things, especially when we consider how sometimes we give presentations that have infographics or they have charts, they have features, images of people, images of events. They all need what is called alternative text, or sometimes it's called an image description. Now, understanding what needs alternative text and what doesn't is sometimes a bit of a challenge. So there is a resource here from the World Wide Web Consortium. They have this alt decision tree, and it kind of is just a yes or no situation of do I need to give this alternative text or and what kind, how detailed, or can I just set it as decorative if I'm working in Microsoft or leave a very basic image description if I'm working in Google Slides. So and sometimes you'll just like, this is literally just an arrow pointing somewhere, or this is just a circle that I wanted because I'm trying to cover up something on the base set of slides. And then that's decorative. Don't worry, you don't have to give every single description for things. It starts to become second nature to understand this is not imparting any important information, so I'm going to mark it as decorative, or I'm going to put it as blank, or this is the bulk of what this slide is about. I want to give as much context as possible. And hyperlinks. So the final part for slide decks that I'll cover is multiple file formats, and especially when we're talking about, we want to use open file formats. That is the kind of the bulk of a lot of what we talk about. At the first step of open access or making something fair is having it be in an accessible format. The problem is, at the moment, the open file formats that we use are not accessible because a lot of these accessibility features are proprietary, and we haven't gotten to a point, at least publicly published, where a file format meets all of the accessibility requirements. So what I often recommend in the practice that I use myself is to provide options. And I usually, for a slide deck, I will upload the PowerPoint slide, so the PPTX. That is the most accessible one if I followed the accessibility checker, if I've done my due diligence. That is made available as the most accessible. I will then also add the PDF, and that to me, I personally consider the reference, the stable reference, because sometimes I work on a Mac. I can't trust fonts as soon as something is exported to PowerPoint, so I consider the PDF to be the reference version, and then I also upload the ODP, or the open presentation format for slide decks. And then that way, when I upload it to Zenodo, when I uploaded it to another reference, there's multiple options and people can choose the one that suits them best. Maybe they want the PDF because they're working with a lower bandwidth and they want to access it on their phone when they have better mobile data. Maybe they need the PowerPoint because it has all of those accessibility features. So that was slide decks. A lot of what we do in working groups and interest groups, though, are documents. We're talking collaborative note-taking documents, we're talking recommendations, and there are just as many ways to make a document accessible, especially the most important thing. Number one on this checklist is document formatting. That is using the proper headings like title, heading 1, heading 2. These are in the styles menu for both Microsoft Word as well as Google Docs. It is style. And this helps give the formatting so that a screen reader knows what the order of operations is. The first thing a screen reader will attach to is title, and then it will go heading 1. And then it will know that what's following from top to bottom in the document, if it's following this heading order, it can impart this information when someone is reviewing the document and referring back to things. So you can imagine sometimes you're reading a document, you're like, oh, wait, I need to refer back to this one section. How do I find it? That's giving meaningful headers and nesting as well. This also helps with creating a table of contents. If you've ever tried to insert a table of contents, a lot of the time it's following this formatting. And then when you do that, you'll be like, oh my gosh, why does it think this is the table of contents? So and sometimes you just get to have to get familiar. If you're like, no, I really like a particular font family, I like a particular size, and this keeps changing it, then you just you do some tweaking in Google Docs, you make it look the way you want, and then you do set as new style. And then that way it's going to fit the formatting that you like. Text formatting, the same as before. Um, the main thing is the use of style options. So when we consider bold and italic, it's so easy to do a quick Control B for bold or a quick Control I for italics. That does not carry additional formatting information. So if you want to have these italics to emphasize something, or this bold to really put importance on something, it's better to use the style options of strong or emphasis, that's what they're called, in it, because that's going to give additional formatting information to the screen reader so that they know, to the person who's receiving this, this is what's important. And again, that formatting also helps when you change font families, because if you go through the motions of bolding and italicizing something, and then you're busy changing fonts, and then you don't realize that, oh, this font is actually quite thicker in the set, and now I actually can't tell what's bold or what's not bold, you can kind of go back and see, okay, everything that's marked with strong or emphasis. And then this came up as like a kind of a fun fact for anyone who's working in education. Hidden text. A lot of the times when we're talking about making assignments for participants that have prompt injections in it to kind of check to see if someone is using generative AI, and they do white text on white background in hopes that the person reading it just control all, selects all, puts it into their AI tool of choice, and they don't see that there's hidden instructions to say things like put banana 5 times, and then they can tell that someone used generative AI without them, necessarily declaring that. That's a very common pedagogical technique. I don't know if it's recommended. I haven't taught in a few years. So um, the screen reader will read your hidden text. It's text the same as everything. So if you put hidden text into a document, we used to do this actually for search engine optimization on websites back when that mattered. It would be a lot of putting white text on a white background so that people didn't know that you were kind of embedding terms so that the search engines would pick it up. The screen reader reads everything. So if you're just, I'm not saying don't use hidden text, just be aware that it is not as hidden as you think it is. So be nice in your hidden text. Table formatting, the rules here are very clear and have reasoning behind it, mainly about the navigation through a table, hyperlinks, color choice, the same kind of things that we need to consider for slide decks are considered in documents. And then, yeah, the final export. Here's where sometimes I recommend, if you have access to both Google Docs as well as Microsoft Office Suite, is to download in the Microsoft format and then just quickly run it through the accessibility checker available in Microsoft, because it will help you do a bit of a faster check for these features that you have to do by hand in Google. There are add-ons that you can add to Google Docs to help with accessibility. However, if you are using institutional accounts within Google, so for instance, my Dance account is what I often use within Google when I'm doing work for Dance, that blocks add-ons. So I can't use the accessibility checker within Google. All right, so both of these checklists have further references that I recommend looking into. Otherwise, you can just kind of go through it, see what makes sense. And, oh, I stopped the share because I need to go back to my slide deck. Da-da-da. So some final thoughts that I wanted to share, and then we'll open up for Q&A. There is no such thing as 100% accessible. This is maybe the most important thing I want to point out is that sometimes what an accessible feature for one person can actually impede another person depending on what their needs are. So I always recommend to provide options where possible. This comes back to why I offer multiple file formats for documents that I make available, but also if you can consider, if especially in the realm when we talk about video, making videos available that have transcripts so that people can determine, okay, I want to see captions on screen, or maybe captions are too distracting for me. I would rather read the transcript, etc. as well. So there's no such thing as perfect. And you likely haven't been taught this. The exception here is if you grew up needing these type of accessibility requirements, or someone in your close friends, family, or someone who trained you needed these and taught you how to do them. Otherwise, I'm 37 years old. I remember being taught Microsoft. The Microsoft Accessibility Checker has been a part of the program for at least 20 years. I did not learn about it until I started giving these types of trainings. You were not taught it. There's reasons for that. It's called ableism. We can talk about that another time if you want to talk about it. I also give workshops on this, but just know that it's not that you missed a day. It's not that you didn't properly read the information. It's that with the few exceptions of people who are really passionate about this, or organizations that have made it a key part of their service, you haven't heard this before. So, feedback from disabled users or collaborators should always trump checklists. At the end of the day, my checklist needed to be updated twice. That's because the advice changed, the technology changed. If you're hearing feedback from collaborators that something doesn't work for them, I would say take it to heart and see how you can do things differently and, thank them for that. That meant that they felt comfortable enough with you telling you where things could be improved. So I think it's very useful to go with this in mind. Changing practices takes time and effort. It can save time in the future. A lot of the times, accessibility checkers, or really any accessibility features. So you've made a slide deck, you've gone through the effort of making sure it's accessible, you've added alt text, you've checked the reading order, you've made the fonts work, you've deleted empty text boxes. You're going to reuse that slide deck. When you copy paste it, when you make another version of this and you're using the same slides into another version, it will take most of these accessible features with it. So you can reuse it easier and it will save time in the future. Also, a lot of the checkers are work as you go. So you can kind of do like a check-in where you're like, okay, I've done a bunch of work here. Maybe I should check before I start copying things and see if I need to change it in the future. This is effort that should be recognized and budgeted for. I often try to remind people that I'm not saying that you need to do this like for free, or that this takes only 5 minutes. This takes time. And you should put this into your internal budgeting for effort, or if you're working on part of a project, making sure that this is put into the work plan. The checking and making sure that things are accessible before they're uploaded to Zenodo is a good practice. And like putting in time for that, maybe it's an hour, maybe it's 2 hours, depending on how large the document is. You can consider it after peer review or before peer review if you want to make sure that the folks reviewing it can access it and give feedback as well. And so if you're interested more about web accessibility, I can highly recommend the resources within the checklist as well. The World Wide Web Consortium, or W3C, they have a subsection, the Web Accessibility Initiative, and this includes a free foundations course. I've taken the course myself. It does not require coding knowledge. It's going from a non-tech agnostic perspective, just telling you why things are important and what to consider, and has a lot of interviews with users who use these accessibility features so they can directly communicate, here's what's important. And so it's a free course. I think it's very useful. So with that, we can do the Q&A.